This is Annette, this is Erica, then beyond Erica is Suzanne, and Paul Cox is at the end, so you know who you're dealing with. We did have a very interesting conversation on Friday to sort of kick the ball going on this subject, and I hope we can actually maintain the momentum we had in this conversation. What we want, the sort of things we want to talk about are actually, are investors getting what they want? What should they want? Are they using what they're getting properly? Where does the IIRC fit into all of this? And I suppose we really ought to have something to say about the European policy that we've just heard about, because this is sort of going to provide a bit of an anchor in years to come. But in the interest of sort of provoking the discussion, I just want to sort of invite Erica just to sort of say, give us a thought to get us going, and see if you can give us something which is going to sort of make us react.
Well, the thought that we talked about, by the way, by way of introduction, so I look after global sector research for UBS Investment Bank. So it's analysts and strategists with a global remit that report to me. And our job is to give investors the kind of advisory proposition they need, which is a way to help them find an edge, okay? Find insight, have a very special knowledge, exquisite knowledge of what a company's mission is and what the priorities are. And I think what I said on our conference call that you might have found interesting was that, in my view, an analyst or strategist or portfolio manager that does not, in some systematic way, incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors into their investment process should be dismissed.
Right. Does that mean that most of them should be on the street, do you think?
No. What it means is that I actually think we may have a language problem to some degree, because I think the vast majority of really good industry and sector analysts have a great deal of knowledge about what is going on at the company level, and certainly they have a great deal of knowledge about the macro structural drivers as well as the company specifics that are driving investment outcomes. I do think there's a disconnect in the language, and I don't think that the process is systematic enough that we can make sure that every analyst and every portfolio manager and investment professional is doing a great job.
Right. Well, let's actually take that proposition to the company representatives here and see, because you're on the receiving end of the questions, you've got a pretty good idea of what it's really like and what the quality of the work is. Annette, do you want to respond to that? How do they come across to you? Do you think it's all right, or is there a long way to go?
I think there's a long way to go. I'm sorry to say that. I mainly get questions, and there are exceptions, but I mainly get questions around, do we have a human rights policy? Do we have a program to address responsible procurement? So tick box kind of questions. I sometimes, but these are rare occasions, get questions that are more for the longer term. How do we, how is Maersk positioned to deal with these major challenges in a 10 to 20 years horizon? Dismissing, of course, we wanted to make this poignant discussion in that sense. I think they should go back to the classroom get some more training and understanding of these issues. Perhaps spend some time in the communities that are hit by the early consequences of climate change. And so should the likes of myself. I'm head of group sustainability in Maersk. I should go back to the classroom as well and learn some language, get some language training in terms of how investors speak, not just speak, but also think, the business models and so on.
But of course, going back to the classroom is something we're trying to do, or the UN PRI and the ICGN are trying to do with the support of the European Commission in providing these courses. So we are people are working on this. But I'm interested in, if I can just pursue this a little further, in what you say about how some do get it and occasionally ask you the sort of really penetrating strategic question, and some just want to check the list if you've got a human rights policy and so on.
Yes.
What sort of people are the ones who are sort of getting it, as it were? Is there something is there a type of investor who you can see sort of coming towards your office who you think that's going to be an interesting conversation, and a type who you know is just going to be wanting to tick the box?
Well, I'm going to be stepping on a lot of toes here, obviously, and that's
all right.
That's all right. Okay. As I said, it's very few investors that I talk to that ask these kind of what I think is interesting questions. Is there a trend? I think probably the large pension funds, if I should say something, name something, and at the other end would be the SRIs who have been charged with a specific set of norms, either exclusion criteria, things like that. Do we transport weapons in our containers? Do we use animals for testing in the products that goes into our supermarkets, and so on?
Suzanne, what about your experience of this?
Well, I think I would like to share a couple of very different conversations that I've had with investors. So we've been engaging with the so-called SRI investors or ESG investments since 2003, so it's been a decade. And in the beginning, it was very much speaking to people who are like-minded. And very much, I met Rob Lake entering here, and he also made this comment that here we are meeting amongst friends. We think the same, we want the same. What we really want is to be able to have conversations that extend to those people who actually are also in the other classrooms. But I will get back to that in a second. So one of the enlightening conversations I had with an investor once was an analyst who said, when I'm looking for alpha, meaning not the tick box exercise, but really looking for what makes a company different, she says she's looking for the 3 C's. And it was very memorable because she says, I look for China, I look for culture, and I look for conduct. And you won't find much of that information in reports or in the formalized disclosure. This is what you need to understand by really getting to know an organization. So China, obviously, as the emblem of emerging markets, culture, the culture of the company, and its ability to adapt to markets globally, and conduct is the consistency between what you say and what you do. And then I would say that I've actually used those 3 C's very much and added the 4th, which in my view is climate, because climate change was what brought ESG factors into the boardroom, into mainstream investments. So that is one anecdote. The other one was a conversation over lunch in Paris. And after we had given our usual rounds of introductions, presenting our business strategy and philosophy, somebody was leaning over and saying, but I don't really get it. Why do you give yourself such a handicap? Why do you make it so difficult for yourself, having to report on E and S and G? Why not just on the business? So obviously he didn't get it. But the point here that I want to make is that this is really, for me, it was an eye-opener that we need, as Erica says, we need a language. We need to have a common language. And for me, that common language is that we don't talk about financials plus the E, the S, and the G, but really talk about the sustainability of the business, of being the sum of all of them. Because if you think about the peacock economy, what the peacock does is it has a huge handicap, but it certainly helps the peacock be sustainable. And in the same way, for companies to actually make that extra effort to think about how to incorporate ESG will be the ones who will have sustainable businesses.
Can I just to pursue what you said a little bit, because you've got these issues that you really feel companies are important to companies. You've mentioned culture and conduct. Your job is to explain your company to investors. How do you actually go about explaining about culture and conduct? How can you report on that in a way that really means something? I mean, we all know this is important, but it's very difficult to grasp, isn't it?
Well, I think that takes me back to the point about reports being one vehicle of communication, but certainly not the only one. And I think we all know, whether you're investors or whether you're company representatives, that at the end of the day, what makes you want to make a decision, investment decision, is, do I trust this person I'm faced with? Do I trust the CEO? Do I trust the CFO? Or the people I meet? And that's when you actually get the sense of the culture and the conduct. But then, of course, any investor, any analyst would not rely only on that written information that is available in the annual report. They would look for other sources of information. And here, the minute they go beyond what the organization is doing and see something different, that's when the likes of Erica and her colleagues will start asking not just the interesting questions, but the tough questions. And that's what gets conversations going.
Can I ask you, how many tough questions have you had in the last 2 months?
Oh, quite a few.
So you do get them?
Yeah.
I mean, you get a lot of sort of routine ones, but you do get them. And you do get tough questions sometimes.
Occasionally, yeah.
Occasionally,
Yes,
occasionally.
yeah.
How many have you had in the last 2 months? Tough ones?
Not a single one.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Now, Paul, you're on the sort of other side of this, because you're representing an asset owner and you are involved in the engagement process. You also give mandates to asset managers. How do you feel about what you've heard? The companies are saying that there's very much a case of could do better here. Is that how you see it, and what do you think you can do to make people do better?
I think that we're very interested in some of the issues that the companies have mentioned so far. So a little bit of background: the National Employment Savings Trust is a very, very new pension scheme. It's a defined contribution scheme, and I think with the resource that we have, we've decided to try and do things not completely differently, but to try and differentiate ourselves by doing things a little differently. And because we're brand new, we haven't got the history of the thinking by history, the thinking by doing. So we can start with a blank sheet of paper in our thinking process. And we have done some of that. So a couple of the emissions that we feel that companies should be telling us is precisely around culture. And I kind of sensed that perhaps it was almost difficult for Susanna to actually describe what it is that should be in the report around culture. Well, what we would like to hear about culture is how the board of directors, the leaders, have adopted a set of values, professionalism, integrity, and how they've adopted those values and how that's inculcated throughout the company and percolating down through all the different levels. Because if we see that, we would be more confident that all the tiny targets and the objectives on sustainability issues are more likely to be met, because we think that the leadership is leading by a good example. So we would call that culture, and that's something that we really do want to see in annual reports. And we also want to see it from the investment research community, rather the research community that feeds the environmental, social and governance interest. We tend not to see it amongst those ratings and measures that we receive. When it comes to conduct, we're very, very much interested in the behaviour, the doing, the how do firms do this, rather than just the structural variables that Anne mentioned. So that would be, for us, we were much less interested about a human rights policy or a diversity policy. Rather, we want to see how diversity is embedded, how the nominations committee report might be talking about its succession targets and its plans. We would be much more interested about seeing how the directors, rather than seeing their CV, the board of directors talking about their behavioural contributions to leadership.